So yesterday, the audience got to hear inspiring remarks from senior cabinet ministers in the federal government, including from Prime Minister Trudeau. This morning, you heard inspiring remarks from Yevhen Choly, Pavlo Grod, on behalf of Ukrainian World Congress, and tremendous insightful remarks from retired General Rick Hillier. And now you have 90 minutes with 3 corporate lawyers who are going to talk about corporate governance. I don't know how this happened, and I'm sorry. I like to talk about governance as akin to taking care of your teeth. Very few people really like doing it, but if you don't do it, you have problems that could be very painful and could last for years. So that's the lens through which I hope the audience can receive this. At the outset, I do want to thank our sponsor. This workshop is presented with the generous support of Fairfax Financial Holdings Limited. Thank you for your contribution, without which this Congress would not have been possible. So I will do brief remarks about who our panel members are, and then we will get into it because we are already behind schedule. So to my far right is Margaret Mason, and she is a charities lawyer and counsel with Norton Rose Fulbright Canada LLP and comes to us from Vancouver. She has more than 30 years of experience advising donors, charities, and other tax-exempt organizations and their boards, often on highly sensitive and complex matters. In addition to advising on gift plans and corporations, charitable registration, governance, fundraising, and CRA audit matters, she helps clients with operational structures. She is ranked by Chambers Canada, an international organization that ranks lawyers in the area of nonprofits and charities, and rated by Best Lawyers in Canada as well in corporate governance practice. And she recently relinquished her practice and passed it off to her successors, so congratulations on your retirement. And Ale vona ne Ukrainka, she did date a Ukrainian in a past life, so she has a little bit of insight into our chromada. John Stefaniuk is a partner with Thompson, Dorfman, Sweetman here in Winnipeg. He engages in a broad practice with emphasis on environmental law, real estate and development law, natural resources and energy, commercial law, and municipal law matters. Outside of his day-to-day practice, he's the former president of the Manitoba Bar Association and also serves as the vice president of the National Board of Directors for the Canadian Bar Association, which represents more than 36,000 lawyers and students across Canada. You think you have problems with your community? Try being in charge of 36,000 lawyers. And I am by far the least qualified person here. I think I'm just on here because I come from the opposite coast. I am Jason Woycheshyn, a partner with Stuart McKelvey, and I'm based out of Halifax. I started my life and born and raised in Vegreville, Alberta, home of the world's largest pesanka. Started my practice in Edmonton and then worked in Bay Street for 13 years. Unlike John and Margaret, I don't put anything together. I'm a litigator, so I go into situations to either start a fight or help to end a fight. And so I have a different perspective when it comes to governance because I see it when it's bad, when stuff has gone wrong. And in terms of my corporate governance experience, I'm the governance chair for Athletics Canada, which is Canada's national track and field organization. I've also been honored to be a part of the Ukrainian Canadian Bar Association since the start of the full-scale invasion in February. But that's enough about us. You didn't come to hear lawyers wax on about themselves. So we will get into it with our presentation, and I will keep our panelists tight to the schedule. So we start with John. John, what is governance?
Well, thank you, Jason. If nothing else, you reminded me to make an appointment with my dentist. So I'm the non-expert expert on the panel. I'm speaking from my experience as a volunteer on various volunteer organizations, including most recently the Canadian Bar Association. And governance is really apart from it's almost more, you should look at it as the active verb of governance as opposed to what is governance as a noun, because governance is about putting the systems in place and implementing the systems in place necessary for the orderly and appropriate running of an organization. And there are various tools and various requirements for good governance, but it's really about systems and discipline and best practices, and ensuring that those are implemented, that there's appropriate follow-up, that there's appropriate communication, and auditing those activities on a periodic basis to make sure that you are doing what's in the best interest of the organization at all times, and that best practices continue to be followed. Margaret can probably give a much better definition.
Well, her next one is, why does it matter? Why does good governance matter?
Well, I guess from my perspective, governance dysfunction is at the heart of every low-performing organization and every organization that is in turmoil. There is no question. And the problems with governance dysfunction have such an impact on organizations because you then look inward. All you're doing is fighting at the board table, or there's a problem with your staff, or something like that, or there's some other problem that's happening in the organization, and it inhibits your ability to carry out your mission. And that, for me, is really the primary thing. Charities and not-for-profits, people come together to do something. But they often come together to do something without any understanding of what it is to run an organization, which is separate and apart from the mission. But the problem is if you don't get the administration of the organization right, your mission suffers. So from my perspective, it is absolutely vitally important that people learn how to do this, because it is a learned skill. And I have acted for I don't know how many hundreds of organizations over the years. And for me, it's absolutely obvious when I come into a boardroom or when I understand what the issue is. I mean, for me, it's pretty easy to pinpoint the governance problem that has arisen. But what is always remarkable to me is how, and it's a skill set that lawyers have, yes, but it's remarkable to me how the organization often cannot see what the problem is. That they think the problem is somewhere else. But the bottom line is they are now focusing on themselves as opposed to the mission. And from my perspective, that's why it is so important to do this. It can be boring, it can be, but it should never be checking off the box. But it is vastly important.
Well, thank you for that. And I think one thing that resonates with me is, all of our community organizations have a different goal or different vision or different mission statement. And what governance allows you to do is come together as a group, all of whom you share that common vision, but allows you to implement it. It's very easy for us in organizations, particularly in times of crisis, to identify the end goal. That is, what are we trying to achieve? But the path to that end goal is what is the challenge, and that's where governance allows you to do it efficiently and in the least amount of time as possible. John is going to talk to us now about directors' duties and responsibilities.
So this is the subject I like to say. It's telling people what they already know, but they need to be told anyway. This is in the context of more organizations that are incorporated. I recognize that there are other forms of organization for volunteer bodies. There can be unincorporated associations. And even if your association or organization is incorporated, there's different sizes and different types of organizations. There are the large organizations where there's professional management and a number of employees, plus your volunteer board of directors. There are small community-based organizations where the board is also the management entity for all intents and purposes, where those are the volunteers. Not only do they run the meetings and the annual general meeting and all that, but they also do the day-to-day heavy lifting and may not have the capacity to have employees or a CEO or executive director. Nonetheless, there are certain common duties and responsibilities for all incorporated associations. And if you're sitting as a director of one of these organizations, you have to be cognizant of these duties and responsibilities. There are a number of legal duties and responsibilities. Those include, if you have employees, making sure the payroll's made, that the appropriate government remittances are made. All of those sorts of things carry personal director and officer responsibility if those things aren't done. You know, getting reports to the board to ensure that those items are dealt with and that you're able to sort of check the boxes and do your necessary follow-up and due diligence. You have a responsibility, a fiduciary obligation to your organization as a director. So that means you must serve and put the interests of the organization ahead of your own and serve it with the utmost good faith. So you have to avoid conflicts of interest and disclose conflicts of interest. You probably don't want to be voting on a resolution to make your spouse's catering company the permanent caterer of all the banquets. You know, those sorts of things. You have to disclose, you have to refrain from voting, and have it recorded in the minutes that you've disclosed your conflict of interest. You must put the organization's interests ahead of your own. As a member, your responsibilities aren't as significant. You know, you can participate or not participate as you choose, depending on what your bylaws require or not require. But if you have a position as a director or an officer, then you have a much greater level of responsibility. Classic sins of poorly performing directors I've been asked to comment upon, and those are legion, but probably the most common sins of directors are not being prepared. You know, coming to a meeting, not reading the materials ahead of time, not being engaged, not being prepared to offer your contribution. You know, there's a certain base level, table stakes of reading materials, getting prepared, participating in a meeting, being an active and engaged participant. You know, sometimes you'll have nothing to say, and your chairperson may be glad of that. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't be participating and engaged and offering your expertise if you have particular expertise to bring to the board. Another cardinal sin is failing to maintain confidentiality. You know, that's a big one. So as a fiduciary, as a director or officer, or you may be both in a small organization, you have a responsibility to the organization. You know, you can't go around and say, oh, you know what Anna told us at the board meeting last week, if it's something that's going to be not in the best interest of the organization. You should be supporting the decisions of the board of directors, even though you maybe have a minority opinion. You shouldn't be going out publicly and saying, oh, that Bogdan, he's an idiot. He may be our CEO, but he's still an idiot. You know, that's not the way to run an organization. You should be supportive of the organization, its decisions. You may have a different opinion, but sometimes when you've been outvoted, you've been outvoted. Maybe you'll be able to change it next year. Other qualities of a good director are kind of the opposite of what a poorly performing director is. They are prepared, they are engaged, they respect confidentiality and act in the best interests of the organizations. They park their own self-interest at the door, and They are active participants. They're aware of their obligations and responsibilities to the organization, and they do their best to meet them. The other classic sin of a director, and it's something that makes a good director, is knowing, especially in larger organizations where there are employees, is knowing the chain of command. You know, as a director, your role is to, in a larger organization in particular, is to set policy and strategy for the organization. You're not to get involved in operational decision making. If there's a professional CEO or executive director, your communication should go from you to the chairperson of the board, who should then bring your concerns or comments to the executive director. You shouldn't be phoning up line employees and staff members and saying, I need you to do this for me, I need you to do this right away. We're having an event, and we need you to do A, B, C, D. That's not your position to do that. There is a appropriate chain of command in all corporations and all organizations. You see this in municipalities all the time, frankly, that the directors try to exercise management authority on the operations of the organization. And that, in my view, is just completely inappropriate.
One thing I might just add in there is what I get asked what is said to me, not uncommonly, is that as a director, oh my God, if I do something, I'm going to lose my house. I mean, there is a real lack of understanding and a conflation of, you know, catastrophic thinking when people serve on not-for-profits and charity boards, that they have some possible financial problem if they make certain types of decisions, and I would be the first person to say no. The chance of you losing your house is virtually nil. Lawyers can never say nil, but that's as close as I can get to it. It's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous thought. And I have literally had organizations where the thinking at the board was so small and so problematic that the staff desperately needed a new vehicle to be able to do the job that they were trying to do in the community. And the bullying chair, if I can put it that way, basically was every board meeting says, we can't buy a vehicle because if we have a car accident, we'll lose our houses. And I get brought in by staff to talk to the board about, you know what I want to say in the meeting. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I mean, you have insurance for starters, and you're never going to lose your house, and there's all those sorts of things. So, this lack of understanding of what the legal obligations and the legal potentialities of what might happen to a director is really big. And so one of the things that I would say is, I mean, this is just a bit of a taster, a sampler of the type of education that you can get in this area. But there are courses, there are all kinds of things that I would strongly recommend that are more formal than this, where you can actually get certificates and that sort of thing to understand what the actual framework that you're operating in. And that's, again, what I see is that people don't understand the framework. Again, really, really want to focus on the mission, but have no understanding of the box in which you're trying to do that.
I think that's very helpful commentary, and it highlights the dichotomy. In the risk profile for every organization is going to be different, and it's a matter of you knowing, understanding the risks, but not being paralyzed by them so that you can achieve your objective. And John, you talked about fiduciary obligations and duty of good faith, and those are concepts that obviously lawyers are familiar with, but even for us in practice, it's tough to articulate, or tough to, you find yourself in gray areas from time to time. So as a director, who do you turn to if it's not a clear-cut solution, whether you have a conflict or how to meet your fiduciary obligation?
Well, that's a tough, if you have an organization that has a professional manager, then perhaps that's a discussion to be held with the CEO or executive director to be had. Other than that, if you have a large enough organization, if you've got it's nice to have a volunteer lawyer on the board so you can bounce things
Maybe.
off of. Or even better if you can pay one. Sometimes, unfortunately, for better or worse, sometimes that's the role that the volunteer lawyer ends up having on the board. As much as volunteers should try and avoid providing the advice regardless of what their profession is, often they're called upon to do that. But there are resources out there, and when in doubt, I guess the question is, you could always err on the side of caution. And if you think you may have a conflict or something like that, or there's an issue, you can always put it before the board. There's nothing like transparency, and disclosure is a big part of that. And recognizing that organizations are different sizes. One thing I've done with organizations I've been involved with is your standard bylaws from days gone by are usually pretty awful in terms of how they assign responsibility. Most volunteer organizations have a president, and you look at the bylaws, and it says the president is the chief executive officer of the organization and does this and this and this and this, which is completely divorced from reality. When the president's only role is to chair the board, and you've got staff that perform those other functions. So, the organizations I've been involved with, I've worked pretty hard to take those officers' positions and take them away from the board and assign them to someone else unless absolutely necessary.
Yeah, just a little bit about bylaws. If you incorporated, and if you incorporated yourself and you use the specimen form of bylaws attached to your province's legislation, I can tell you right now, they're not going to fit your organization, because there's no organization. Bylaws are not a one-size-fits-all. And one of the characteristics of a high-performing organization is that you actually look at your bylaws every couple of years, and it should be on a rotation that you do this to make sure that you are fully compliant with your bylaws, because you are legally obligated to be fully compliant. And if you're not, you either change your bylaws, if you can, depending on the requirements of your jurisdiction, or you need to change what you're doing. And that's super important. And that's one of the things that we expect of a high-performing organization. And I'll just segue into the good governance part, is that you actually look at your bylaws regularly, that you look at every single one of your policies on a regular basis to make sure that it still reflects the types of things that you should be doing. The characteristics of good governance are that directors understand what their role is and what the limitations of it are if you have staff. If you don't have staff, that's a different thing, because your organizations develop on kind of a staircase. You start off all volunteers, all hands on deck, but then you get to the point, first step up, you have your first employee, and then after that, and the director's roles change over time. And that again can be a problem in an organization if they get stuck in the all hands on deck, and it's no, actually you have 6 employees, you have moved to a different role. Again, it's to understand those sorts of things. Another characteristic of a high-performing organization is that they're able to develop a distinct board culture in terms of what's acceptable behavior and what is not acceptable behavior, and that anything that is not acceptable is swiftly dealt with. And I'll give you one example. We had an organization, it was a community-based organization, kind of like a board of trade, and a person was elected to the board who is actually a radio shock jock kind of person, but very active in the community. They thought he'd be interesting. Comes on the board, comes to the first board meeting, that's fine, and then he goes on his radio show and blasts every single member of the board for what the organization is not doing, et cetera, and I had the lovely experience of phoning him to say, you don't seem to understand what your job is here, what your role is here, because when you're a director, you must be an uninhibited promoter of the organization. You are a cheerleader. You can't do the reverse. And if you want to do the reverse, you can't sit on the board. So those are some of the types of things. And a couple of things for individual directors is that there is a duty to participate, to speak up in meetings. There is actually a duty about that. And I once sat on a board, came onto a board, and there was a former MP on the board that I kind of knew a little bit. And in 8 board meetings, he did not say a single word. And so I finally went to the chair and said, why is he here? Why is he here? You are to bring your talent. You're to bring your wisdom. You're to bring the things that you know from your life to the board. And it is a positive obligation to do that. There's actually some case law about those with special skills. And so, for example, if you're a lawyer or an accountant, in this particular example, the person's an accountant, the organization is going into a real estate transaction. And the accountant thinks, super bad idea. Pro forma, looked at the numbers, thinks it's a super bad idea, but doesn't speak up at the board because, everybody's so enthusiastic and everything else. Well, of course, it went very badly wrong, and the directors were potentially going to be personally liable, but there are provisions in each of our provinces' legislation to relieve directors from their liability if they've done their best, et cetera, et cetera. In this particular case, the accountant was not relieved from liability because he had a positive obligation to actually say something, even if unpopular. Don't go with the flow. That's one of the other duties, is to be courageous. Yes, I have special skills, but one of the things I find when I go on boards is I sit there in my first meeting going, don't be a bitch. Don't be a bitch. Keep your mouth shut, learn the lay of the land, understand who's who in the zoo, etc. I'm not very good at that, because if I see a problem, I want to say something about it. So I commend, even though it's not the most popular thing, I commend it to you. Again, you're there to advance the cause, not yourself. See that a lot in fundraising boards like hospitals and universities and colleges, that sort of thing, where it's a society kind of board where people are there for their connections and that sort of thing. But for many reasons, they're there for the wrong reason. And it's about their own personal aggrandizement or status in the community, that kind of thing. And often they're very low-performing directors. If you're on a fundraising board, your job is to fundraise, not to go to the gala. It's to actually go and ask people for money. And if you don't want to do that, don't go on the board. Don't go on just to organize and attend the gala. That's just not happening. All directors should be passionate about the organization. Now, don't go on a board where you don't want to, where you don't believe in the organization, because part of your job is to promote it, to tell everybody, I'm on this board and it's great and we're doing this and it's super important. And I guess one of the last things I would say on high-performing directors is that they appreciate staff. They need to be thanked. They need to be told that they're doing a good job, and that's super important in terms of that. Another aspect of good governance is to organize the board's time efficiently. So to give you one example is I'm working, I've been at the office at 7:30, I've got a board meeting at 7 o'clock, I probably haven't eaten dinner, I'm grumpy and I've had a long day. And then I'm there for a 2-hour board meeting, and the first hour and 15 minutes are taken up by reports of stuff that I've read because it was in the board package. And then with 20 minutes left to go in the meeting, it's after 9 o'clock, which is, when I was working, is kind of my bedtime. We're asked to deal with the tough issue of the day the board needs to deal with. Reorganize and rethink your meetings. Don't do them the way you always thought you should do them. All the bump, either don't talk about it, like committee reports and that sort of thing. Put it in the package and people read something. You don't need to talk about it. And you do what we call a consent agenda, which is you're presumed, as you should have, read everything. If there's a question, we'll deal with that, but otherwise, we are not doing the reports. We are only dealing with the issues that the board needs to deal with, because the board is there, when you have staff, to help staff do their job. And sometimes, I'll give you, one more example before I quit, is that there was a very high-performing board that I was on. I was not the chair. But the chair was the best chair I've ever seen, and he was the CEO of a big company, so yes, I would expect him to have the skill set. But what had happened was that an opportunity had come to this organization to organize this big conference. It was a little off mission, but it would have been a very big deal for profile and all that sort of thing, and the CEO and the staff were super excited about it. So they come to the board meeting and they report that they're going to do this and that sort of thing, the board was, okay, you know, that's interesting. And then at the end of the meeting, we had the in-camera, which is, you should do every single meeting, in camera with the CEO, so it's board and just the CEO, where you talk about various things that the CEO doesn't want to talk about when other staff are in the room. And then you should always have a board in camera. And I've had many executive directors and CEOs push back on me on this, which is, no, because I want to know what the board's doing, going, not your business, you're the employee, not the boss. And the board should meet in camera. And in this particular example, once the CEO was out of the room, everybody said, wow, great opportunity, but we're really worried about that because it's a little bit off mission. It's going to take a lot of staff resources away from our main thing, which is also the thing that brings in the financial wherewithal for the organization to keep running. So it's going to be a real diversion of staff time and energy from the main thing that we need them to be doing. And so the CEO said, fine, I will have my debrief with the board chair. I'll have my debrief with the CEO. And what that debrief was, the board has raised some concerns with this particular thing. These are the concerns. It's up to you as the CEO. You're operational. But here's the wisdom that we're bringing. Here's the, second look that we're bringing to you about why we just think that this is probably not a good idea. But it's totally the CEO's decision. In this example, the CEO ultimately decided not to go ahead with it, but that is how it is supposed to work, just to give you one example.
So I think for me, the takeaways from the comments from both Margaret and John have been a fewfold. One is, if you're a director, everyone on the board needs to be a driver, not a passenger of the organization. Everyone is responsible for steering the ship. No one's just along for the ride, to use Margaret's words. Two, another thing that comes out, particularly in nonprofit community organizations, is imposter syndrome. Everyone, or some people think everyone else is smarter, everyone else has a skill set, I don't have a skill set, so I'm going to be that passive participant. That's not the case at all. Often, to use Margaret's example, once you start speaking about both your insecurities, your knowledge gaps, or your concerns, you find out that other people have and share those very same insecurities and doubts or concerns about the organization. So don't suffer from imposter syndrome. Third, don't assume. Don't assume that someone else is actually taking care of the bylaw review or a particular governance issue. Ask the question. It's important to ask and not assume. And then the last part about timing is it's very common in organizations where there's a lot of passion for meetings to go on a long time because everyone's passionate about the issue. And that has a tendency to alienate some people and say, I can't do it, I can't participate. But it's easy to sort of view it as the board versus me. But as a director, you're equally as responsible as everyone in that room to ensure that the meeting runs efficiently. So if it's not running efficiently, from your perspective, you need to voice that and be an instrument of change, not an instrument of complaint and withdrawal from the organization.
The board chair's role is so important, and the board chair is not the boss, and I've seen far too many bullying chairs. The best chair I have ever seen never spoke in the meeting until he had ensured, and I tried to model myself on that for me personally, until everyone else and calls on people, what is your view? What is your view? And only after the room has been canvassed does the chair bring forward their view. I think that's really, really important. And again, the chair is not the boss, and if your chair is hopeless, then you gotta do something about it. I vibrate, visibly vibrate when a chair is inefficient, when a chair runs over time. It makes me crazy. Because lawyers are pretty cognizant of time when we look after our days in 6-minute increments. We write that down. So using people's time wisely is super important. And one just last thing I would say too is, in terms of looking at your bylaws, The number of directors and term limits, to me, are hugely important. To me, the sweet spot on the board is 8 to 12 people, somewhere in that range. And that is because that's enough people to do the work that needs to be done at the board level, and it's not too many to be unwieldy and to allow people to hide. You actually have to do something if you're on that board. Term limits are also huge. Term limits, I mean, for me personally, I truly believe that for every board membership, there is about a 6-year, I would call it an energy arc. You come on, you've got about 2 years to figure out what's going on, to see everything that's happening, to understand where you'll be useful, the 2 years where you're really, really useful, and then the last 2 years where you should be personally responsible for finding your successor, for finding something with your skill set, with even a bigger skill set or contributions to make. And I find that boards that don't have term limits, where people serve forever, it's you know, the second Thursday in the month, I have my board meeting. I haven't read my package because, you know, it's so old school, et cetera, et cetera. I just go to the meetings because this is something I've always done for 20 years. Wrong, bad, absolutely bad. I once was giving a presentation on, you know, compliance with our Society Act and these sorts of things, and I made these types of remarks, and I had a young woman stand up and said at some point during the conversation that, you know, she had a huge problem with their board. They were completely useless to her. They just came to meetings, and all they did was pick apart our financial statements, et cetera, et cetera. They didn't do anything. And so I eventually said, well, did you have term limits? You know, how long have these people been on the board? And she said, well, one person's been on the board for 26 years. And I mean, I just started laughing because I said, well, that's your problem. And then she said, well, it's my mother. And you know, for me, that was just, okay, I can't solve that problem for you. But to me, it was just classic. I mean, these people they're just doing it. They're going through the motions. But is it bringing forward the mission? You have your CEO who's totally frustrated.
And I've seen this in our community and recently planning an event. It was me and a non-lawyer looking at who was going to be attending. And I said, oh my God, this individual's been on the board since 1993. And she said, that's fantastic. Look how committed he is. I was like, that's terrible. You need new blood. Every organization needs new blood. He could be the best person, the best board, but everyone has the arc. The arc is inevitable. John, any additional comments on that?
Yeah, forgive me for I have sinned, because I sat as 6 years as a chair of a fundraising board locally, a high-profile fundraising board, to get some things over the finish line. And it took longer than expected, so I kept saying, I got to get out of this, I got to get out of this, I got to get out of this, but stayed longer than I probably should have. But got things wrapped up, and I could leave with a clear conscience. But yeah, 6 years is kind of the sweet spot for maximum terms as directors. And you know, one of the main jobs of a board of directors that has staff is to evaluate that senior staff person on a regular basis. So if there's an executive director, if there's a CEO, that's one of the main functions of the board as well, or a committee of the board, is to provide that regular evaluation based on hopefully approved performance indicators or objectives for the year or for whatever period of time is appropriate, and to have that feedback session and set objectives for the following period, for the following year, and measure performance against those objectives. And for the executive director or CEO, one of their key jobs should be to plan for their replacement as well. And that shouldn't be lost sight of. So as part of the individual's evaluation, one of the questions that should be asked is, all right, you're doing a great job, fantastic, we love you. How are you planning your replacement? You know, what's your exit strategy? You're going to be here forever, or is this a 5-year gig, or is it, you know, what are you looking at? So we know, so that we're not going to get caught shorthanded or with our pants down when you suddenly announce that you're going to be a surfing instructor in Maui and you're leaving next week. You know, no one wants to be in that position. All right, so the next item here, I'll just keep the mic for now, is the meeting planning and running effective board meetings. And we've already heard about some of the things that are very important, including the role of the chairperson of the board in keeping the meeting rolling. You know, there are, the consent agenda, I think, is really important. You know, our Canadian Bar Association meetings will have a 50-page board package that comes to us before our board meetings. 40 pages of that is the consent agenda, that you read it ahead of time, and unless there are any questions, it takes this long. All right, now we're doing with the consent agenda. Are there any questions? Okay, there are no questions. All right, that's dealt with. That takes care of that 40 pages of material, like that. You know, there are rules of procedure out there too that people reluctantly use from time to time. Some people, you know, every once in a while you get on a board where there's someone is the master of Robert's Rules of Order.
Or not, really.
Or something. So if you do have rules of procedure and you've adopted them through your bylaws or otherwise, you know, it doesn't hurt to use them once in a while either. There's all sorts of things that can be done. You can move to amend agendas. You can table motions. You can cut off debate. If you can't do it just by cajoling people, you can get more formal. If you have, particularly helpful if you have a disorderly organization, or sometimes ineffective chairperson, is to say that okay, you know, chairperson's not doing anything here. Let's. I'm going to call a question. Let's vote. You know, at some point you've got to make a decision. So there are rules of order. People can use them if you've adopted them. It's nice to have some understanding of how they work. Hopefully it doesn't come to that on a regular basis. It's not Parliament, but they can certainly be helpful, especially if you have an organization that has public meetings, meetings of members. You know, that's a whole other kettle of fish, is your members' meetings, and keeping those under control.
And you might, if you do have those kinds of big messy meetings, and particularly perhaps if your chair isn't that effective, you know, our suggestion always is that you think about hiring a parliamentarian. And it's basically the person who runs the meeting and makes sure that everybody, I mean, the point of a parliamentarian is to make sure that everybody has a everybody is respectful, and that everybody has the opportunity to speak, and there's no shouting and those sorts of things.
And agendas is one of the things on our agenda here. Agendas are important, so people know what they're going to be hearing about, what you're going to be discussing, have materials in advance so they can have an opportunity to look at them and digest them. You can have a regular form of agenda that you modify from time to time, so you get this report, that report, to make sure you're doing it. Having a board calendar is a nice thing to do. Do you need a report from the treasurer or on finance every single meeting when nothing much is happening in between meetings? Why is that necessary? Can you do it quarterly? Can you do it even less frequently? How necessary is it to your organization? Have a nice little calendar. This meeting, the social committee is going to report on the coming years of the events for the year and where things are at. The next meeting is going to be from the treasurer and give us a financial update. Next meeting, it might be from somebody else. One meeting you may have, you may rotate among staff in an organization to give them an opportunity to present to the board and say, here's what we're doing in our area, here's all the exciting things we do, really appreciate this opportunity to speak to you. Not only does it help educate the board in terms of the operations of the organization, but it usually makes staff feel really, really good if they're given the opportunity to present at a board meeting, just to talk about what it is that they're doing. It's not for you to ask a lot of questions and criticize what they're doing, because that should be going through your executive director or CEO, but it's just to find out what's going on. It's actually nice. And the role of the chair is important. You know, depending on who you're, lawyers, organizations with lots of lawyers on the board, the interesting thing is that everyone wants to say something, especially the litigators, you know. Well, I agree with what Paul said, and here's the 5 reasons why that I agree. You know, you have a little bit of self-restraint, and if a board chair can just say, you know, direct people to say, if you got anything new to say, does anyone have anything new to add? If not, we're going to move this to a vote. It's a good practice to develop. You know, you can have a light touch or you can have a heavy touch where necessary, but meetings have to move along.
And one thing I would say about Robert's rules or other procedural rules, I mean, they're pretty fancy for many organizations, and you often see in bylaws, we will follow Robert's rules, and my first question is always, do you? And the organization typically says no, and it says, well, that's got to come out. It doesn't have to be in there. You're not required to use any set of parliamentary rules. Roberts isn't the only one that exists. You may be quite comfortable operating the meetings by way of consensus, and particularly if you have a good chair and controls the meetings, keeps them on time, that sort of thing, it's okay. But if you have a really fractious organization, or often if you have a large membership and you have messy membership meetings, you know, your AGM or whatever, then having a system of rules is quite important because it actually helps everybody do things. But one thing that I do see commonly when boards have dysfunction is what I would call the weaponizing of Robert's rules by somebody who basically understands the absolute opposite of what the rules are for. So if I had $1 for everybody who told me that calling the question means that debate ends when I instantly say these magic words, no, it's a question saying, are we ready to end the debate? That's what calling the question actually means. And Robert's rules, again, are there to promote good governance. They're not to be weaponized to try to cut stuff off when people want to speak. So that's quite an important thing that people just don't necessarily understand. There's lots of courses on Robert's rules. As I said, hiring a parliamentarian can often, sometimes the parliamentarian is just there to advise the chair, to help the chair. Sometimes they actually chair the meeting. You know, I've observed many over the years, and I remember one particularly fractious meeting where the registered parliamentarian who was running the meeting was fantastic. He got up at the front of the room and said, okay, here's the deal. If you want to speak, you will come to me and you will go on the speakers list. You speak for 1 minute and 1 minute only. If you want to speak again, you go at the bottom of the list and I will cut you off, and et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, because that person was strong and clear, the meeting actually settled right down. I've also been at meetings that gone for 4 hours, people yelling and screaming, and I'm sitting in a corner going, kill me now. So, I mean, use people's energy wisely.
And on that point, I mean, one of the comments that I hear coming out of the discussion is, you know, your chair is a very important person and has a very important role in ensuring that the organization moves forward in accordance with its objectives. A skill set for a good chair is somewhat innate. Some people have it, some people don't, but it also is a learned skill. No one comes into a chair position having all the answers. So my question for you, Margaret, is, how much runway do you give a person who's in the chair role to develop into that skill set, to sort of see, do they have it or don't they? I know that's a difficult question.
Well, it's a tough question because it depends on the organization, but I'll just give you a few comments. I am not a huge fan of lockstep executive offices, like you become the secretary, then the treasurer, then the vice chair, then the chair. I hate that. The organization should be looking at what are the things that are coming up in the next couple of years, and what skill set do we need at the chair level to be able to deal with that? So how do you know 4 or 5 years ago when somebody comes into this lockstep structure that they are the right person to be the chair in possibly a very tough moment? So I really think that everything should be on the table every time you have an you elect your officers. The chairs, it's so, I find this a very frustrating thing because again, people will lockstep through and they have zero skill set and no willingness to learn, and possibly no willingness to take any constructive criticism. And so what that means is that the chair is often the source of dysfunction of the organization. And And I am being brought in, generally speaking, by staff who can see the dysfunction and can't do anything about it, with somebody who doesn't understand or appreciate what their role is. So it's a really tough question to ask. What I would ask all of you is, if you're considering a chair role, really learn to understand what it is. And you're the servant. Again, it's when I used to do estate planning, I would talk to the executor. You're not the boss, you're the servant. And that's what the chair is. The chair is there to run the meetings efficiently, to liaise with the senior staff person, to make sure the organization runs well, to make sure that all the directors perform. I mean, the chair has the hard stuff. If you've got a non-performing director, the director is supposed to be, the board chair is supposed to be having that quiet chat. Why are you here? Why are you causing so much disruption? What's your point here? Are you helping us? You know, there's a lot of things that fall to the chair, and it shouldn't just, I fell into the role. It should be intentional.
So I don't think there's any particular royal jelly that makes someone an excellent chairperson. I think it comes with education and experience. And this comes to another role of the board, or can be a committee of the board, is recruiting and identifying and recruiting other prospective board members through a nominating committee or the board as a whole. And looking at the board on a regular basis, boards often have a skills matrix that identify we need these skill sets among our board members. All right, who has the financial background? Who has a legal background? Who has a business background? Who has a social service background or something, you know, whatever, depending on the nature of the organization. And identify a skills matrix, and then actively go out and recruit people who might fill that matrix. And it may not be, depending on the size of your organization and its composition, you may have a structure with a lot of committees and subcommittees, which give people an opportunity. You can test them out and have people appointed into your committee structure. And it's a great way of recruiting new board members, identifying them and recruiting, because you can see who the high performers are in your subcommittees sometimes, or you can see in the community or other organizations. There are groups of nonprofit organizations out there whose executive directors and others are quite happy to share information. I don't think they want you poaching their boards, but they can certainly tell you who's performed well on their boards, and you can identify those people and ask them. And you know, it's usually the thing that it's always the busiest people that you're asking anyway, because they seem to be the ones in the most demand. So you can, there are the whole recruitment and revitalization process is essential to the proper functioning of a board.
It's super important, and there's an intentionality piece that I would highly commend to you. That is, you know, you have a matrix, and you should be really intentional about the skill set of people that you want. Not, oh, we need 3 new directors. No, we need 3 new directors with these types of characteristics, and then go out looking for them. Don't say, oh, our accountant has retired or termed out. We need an accountant. Oh, you know, my sister's accountant might do it or whatever. No. Yes, you need someone with accounting skills, but you also need someone who would be passionate about your organization. And every part of every director's job is to look at your network of people that you know, to flag someone who may or may become passionate about your organization because of what you know of them and may have the accounting skills. But those 2 things have to come together. And again, it's not, oh, we need an accountant on our board. That's way too simplistic. It has to be more intentional, more directed. If you want to be a high-performing board to get this administrative piece done, that's the type of energy you have to bring to recruitment.
That's very helpful comments. And our last little bit before we'll turn it over to questions is talking about crises. So regardless of how efficient your organization runs, how perfect your governance is, crises will impact every organization at one time. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So Margaret, in 10 minutes, how do we deal with crises?
Well, yeah, I'll do it in a couple of minutes and get every. But so one of the things that you should have is something we typically call a risk register. the Word document, it's a chart, it's whatever. It's a list of the potential risks your organizations may face, how high that risk is, the potential impact it may have on the organization. So for example, if you are an organization that receives 100% of your funding from the province, that would go on your risk register to say, it's a risk because we don't have the diversification of funding sources. What could happen? The government could change its mind. And so then you say, what should we be doing in this situation? And maybe it's trying to diversify your funding sources. So there's those sorts of things. But I think the types of risks we're also looking at are what are the risks that may come from humans, from employees, employment-related matters. These days, sexual harassment, any type of human rights offense that might happen can often be incredibly dramatic. It can get in the news, all those sorts of things. We've seen many. We've seen the We Charity, we've seen, you name it, it's been there, and you can only imagine. For me, the We Charity one was kind of interesting because the board was turning on itself, which is when you have the board chair basically saying, the brothers weren't giving me the financial information, and I'm kind of going, I'm sorry, you're the chair of the board, you're entitled to it. So what's been going on? There's just all, that's just something. But so you should have a register. You should be thinking ahead of time what you do. People leave, all those sorts of things. So there should be a risk register, and there should be something, a bit of a plan for certain things. For example, your CEO gets hit by a truck. What do? You should have a plan for those sorts of things. But what's the famous line, no one plans for the Spanish Inquisition? The things that really hit you hard are the things that come out from nowhere. And then calm is the thing that you need to deal with, and then generally speaking, you need to hire help. And you're going to, generally speaking, need a lawyer, and you may very well need a communications person if you don't have that expertise in-house, if there's potential of it going public. Often we see that the whole board, it might be of a size where it's just too unwieldy for the entire board to be dealing with the necessary increase in the number of meetings and a variety of things that need to be dealt with. So often a subcommittee is something that's set up to deal with these crises. But it can be horrible. And the first thing I say to directors, particularly if matters are internal and or just messy and going public, is I say to them, you're all volunteers. Do you want to stick around for this? Because it's going to be hellish. I once had an organization where the province of British Columbia had doubled their rent by their long-term care facility, and they had a certain amount of money from the health authority to pay for operating, and the province of BC adjusted how they did their rents, and so the rent doubled overnight. And every month they were going underwater by $20,000 or $30,000. They had no other source of funding. It was all older people that had been on the board for ages, and I was hard, and it was just, and I said, what do you want to do? And so everybody quit. I said I begged 3 to stay so that I could say, you can give me instructions, and my instructions were to go to the health authority and say, to whom do I deliver the keys? Because the organization was saying is, we're done. We're done. And if the health authority wants to run this care facility, that's fine, but we're out of it. So there are those types of issues that can be so dramatic. So the first question always is, who wants to stick around for this? Because it's going to be a bit of a roller coaster.
And just on the consultation point, I recognize that many of the organizations have tight budgets, and often there's a concern, well, we can't afford to hire anybody. But when you're in that potential crisis situation where it could turn very ugly, you can't not afford not to hire someone. And I think each of us have been in situations where we wish the client would have got us involved a week earlier, 2 weeks earlier, because the crisis that they're in now is far worse than it was had they made that call. And if you have a trustworthy advisor, whether that be a PR person, a lawyer, whomever, they will tell you, you don't need me right now. It's not yet right for my advice. And they're not going to try to take money for nothing. So, but you need to have those relationships, and you need to have them planned in advance, in the sense that if a crisis happens, I know this is the person I'm going to call, as opposed to it's crisis mode, people are jumping ship. Does anyone know anybody? And because then you don't have that established relationship. So I think that's sort of my takeaways from, in terms of being proactive and dealing with the early stages of the crises.
And never terminate an employee for cause without getting legal advice. Never, never do it, because often you don't have cause in the technical sense.
Yeah, and in terms of crises, I don't think either one of us were throwing our names forward to jump on the board of Hockey Canada, for instance. Crisis can affect you as a chairperson of a board quite unexpectedly too. I remember one weekday morning sitting in my office and then having my receptionist call me up and to tell me that there were some people there to see me, so I found a boardroom to walk into, and the entire staff of 15 from the organization that I was volunteer board chair at came to my office and said that either the CEO goes or we are all going. Because things were highly dysfunctional and highly disrespectful, and it was an interesting moment. So we tried to work with the CEO for 6 months to no avail, and things had to change. So that, you'll have those situations too, where all of a sudden you're a volunteer, you're put in a situation that you didn't sign up for. No one signed me up for being effectively an interim CEO while the new CEO hunt was on. So you have to decide for yourself, did I sign up for this, and am I going to be willing to do it and to perform a more extraordinary service in the circumstances as a volunteer? No one's put a gun to your head to make you do it. You have to decide what your level of commitment and ability is to assist the organization through some of those troubled times, and get the professional help that you need to do it, assuming the resources are there. If they're not there, then you really have to question whether the viability of the organization, the board, and what you can realistically commit. And maybe it's not for you. Maybe it's going to have to be someone else that does that.
And every crisis is different, but what I would say is to collect, you're going to need help, but it's to collect every piece of information that you've got in writing, because it's the first thing that's going to be asked for. What emails, what letters, what's happened. You need to collect that ASAP to do that. And it is, all hands on deck and can be very unpleasant.
But at the same time, and not to be contrarian, but if it's a very sensitive confidential matter, you need to determine whether it's a matter that the board can properly and nimbly enough manage as a whole, or whether a special committee needs to be appointed. And that's a judgment call that you need to make as a group, but also preferably with advisors. A special committee of 3 independent members is far more capable to move an investigation forward quickly than the whole board. It also protects who's under the cone and information leaks, and if that's particular sensitivity, you need to be mindful of that. So 3 are more nimble than 12, and that's sort of a general rule. So to the extent that you need to act quickly, you need to act sensitively with a very confidential investigation, then having a special committee is something that I would commend to you to consider. All right, you have 3 lawyers up here, probably with a collective hourly rate of $2,000 an hour. It's now your chance to milk that for everything you got. So we're here to answer any questions. Yakis Pitanya. Sorry, I can't see. Can you actually go to the mic? One, because I feel like I'm looking into the sun.
Okay. Good morning, Taras Kulish from Ukrainian Canadian Bar Association. And just to jump off on that question, for you, Jason, as the litigator, maybe you can talk to people about, you know, the concept of litigation hold, preserving documents. What does that involve?
Yeah, and that's a very good question, Tarase. So there's different types of privilege that exist, and one of the things that you want to do in any sensitive situation is to maximize your scope of privilege. Privilege can be waived, so just because you're putting a cone of protection and confidentiality on documents doesn't mean you can't change your mind later, but you want to ensure, one, that documents are preserved, and that to the extent that what's called litigation privilege can be established, that it be established clearly and you know which documents it applies to. So your starting point is, again, figuring out who's in the know with respect to the crisis. 2 is getting a note out as quickly as possible, and the nature of disclosure in that note depends on the sensitivity, but you need to get a note out to everyone who could potentially have documents in their possession to say, no one's getting rid of anything. There's a hold. You need to get IT involved to the extent you have IT involved immediately so that there can be no deletion of documents, because if it's a very sensitive situation with liability exposure, there's a tort of spoliation. So the organization and its directors could, again, not to be fear-mongering, be potentially liable for not preserving evidence. So who's in the know? Figure that out. Get a note out as quickly as possible to preserve documents, and then typically in consultation with either those people who are leading the investigation or outside advisors, figure out a plan to go through the documents in a structured but effective manner, because often in these types of crisis situations, everyone's like, okay, we got 10,000 documents, we got to start going through them. No, you're quickly going to run out of time and blow through way too much money. You need to have a sort of a structured idea in terms of how most effectively to review those documents. Thank you for that question.
A question, it's Myron Oleksishin. I'm with Ukrainian Credit Union, part of the Ukrainian credit system in Canada. The question has to do with being asked to be on an advisory committee. So you're not part of the board, but you're asked to provide advice. Apparently, there's no liability. What is really the exposure or responsibility if you're asked to be on an advisory committee? So you're not part of the board.
I'll just speak to it from an organizational standpoint, not the legal liability standpoint. I'll let the expert address the legal liability piece. But, you know, advisory boards and advisory committees can sometimes be great if their role is spelled out clearly. If the roles are ill-defined, then the advisory committee members don't have any skin in the game. They don't feel like they're real participants in many situations. Or conversely, they believe that they're running the show, which is probably a bigger problem. I think advisory boards are really nice if you're actually going to take their advice on strategic issues, because you get a breadth of experience, or if they're sort of like an honorary board, that you get all these people who like to be affiliated with an organization or who are potential donors to an organization. You want to give them some sort of special recognition and have them get together for a dinner once a year or twice a year and talk about all the great things that the organization is doing and ask them to open up their checkbooks. Those kinds of things are great for advisory or affiliated boards or honorary member type boards. But if you can have a real advisory board, you have to have a defined purpose for them and make sure that's communicated to those members. In terms of liability, that's a different question.
Well, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of the advisory boards because of what I would call the governance blur is often not clear. So I'll give you the classic lawyer's answer. It depends. It truly depends on the nature of the tasks that have been assigned to the advisors and how it's dealt with internally. The vast majority of times, I would say that there's no liability. But again, if you do have that governance blur and there's somebody that is coming to every single board meeting and, those sorts of things, you're creating a de facto situation that might create an issue.
Thank you.
And as a litigator, just to add to that, if I have evidence that there's an advisory committee and they're actually involved in decision-making, and I'm on the attack, and this isn't obviously in the nonprofit context, but even in the public company context or a for-profit context, I will sue everyone who's involved in the decision-making process. Not just because I think I might increase my chances of recovery, but it creates a wedge opportunity for me as a litigator, because I know the advisory people aren't going to be wanting to be a part of that lawsuit, and you start getting finger pointing. So that's just the litigation risk in terms of what.
And they may not have directors and officers liability insurance either.
And whether they're covered under the D&O policy of the organization, if it has it, is sometimes questionable.
So as a litigator, they might come to me early with information that is very helpful for me in exchange for letting them out.
Nomenclature. The term executive director is used frequently. The question is an executive director a director?
Okay, can I take that one? Okay, executive director is such a 1950s. It's a total 1950s thing. You know, I hate the term. It makes it unclear. It's used in the nonprofit. You know, they're a CEO. Call them that. I mean, anybody who's an ED should be called a CEO, in my view. It's just a really old-fashioned term. It's kind of used. You know, they are your senior employee. They are the chief person involved in implementing your strategy. They should have the title that goes along with it. So it's just an old-fashioned kind of archaic kind of title that we still use.
And you were earlier, someone suggested that a director should have a 6-year term limit maximum. Are you saying officers too should equally be treated that way?
So I'm presuming by officers you mean director-type officers, not employees?
We have both conditions.
Okay, so let's deal with director-type officers, like the chair, you know, secretary, those sorts of things. So generally speaking, directors should serve, in my view, 2 terms of 3 years or 3 2 years. Officers are elected every single year, and their appointments should generally be, board officers, and their appointments should be for a year. That would be my ideal situation.
Right.
It's very different for employees. I mean, if they're hired as employees, I mean, generally speaking, their employment is indefinite. And so if you're hiring a CEO, that person serves in that role indefinitely until their employment is terminated. So it is different.
Okay, thank you.
So in many cases, your CEO should be fulfilling the role of president, as is usually described in the bylaws under the management hat, and the chairperson of the board is a different role. But in terms of the succession through various board positions, whether you call them president or chairperson, secretary, treasurer, all those board positions, that's all part of the 6 years. So 6 years includes your term as president or vice president or finance chair or whatever that is. It's not 6 years as a director and then 2 years as chair, secretary, and 2 years as president.
Totally. And I would talk about the difference between the sort of president and chair, because there's a lot of, you know, in public companies, you know, it's the president and CEO, they combine those roles. I find that's very confusing in the nonprofit and charitable sector. So my view of it is that you should have a board chair, period. We don't use the president role at all, or I recommend that you don't use the president role at all, because people don't really understand what the duties are. So you have the chair of the board, and you have the CEO, and those are the 2 senior positions. No president, no nothing.
Hi, my name is Anastasia. I actually have a few questions. They might be related to each other. I've heard different opinions, so I'm wondering on the best practices. How do you see, like, if you see the conflict of interest when a major sponsor would like to join the board? And another question might be somehow related to it. Usually officers are elected every single year. And as you mentioned that before AGM, usually a president or CEO, he would go and seek people or confirm with other existing already officers if they're planning to return on a board. And usually before AGM, you pretty much know your board directors. But sometimes happens that someone just stands up and voluntarily say, I would like to join the board. And as a president or CEO, you see that that person is seeking to influence the board decisions in the future. How would you prevent that? Because technically you can't say, no, you cannot join the board, but how would you prevent that conflict of interest?
Why don't I deal with the second one first? It all comes down to your bylaws to some extent, and I am not a fan of having AGMs where people can willy-nilly nominate people from the floor to stand on the board. It's not focused, it's not intentional. Oh, my friend Bob would be great. You know, no, I mean, that's not, the organization should be, who do we need on this board? What are the skill sets? Not just random people who get worked up at a meeting. So your bylaws, in my view, should basically say is we don't do the nomination from the floor thing. We actually have a nomination procedure and system where well before the AGM, anybody who wishes to stand for the board has to put their name forward. They have to be nominated by a couple of existing members of the organization. It goes to a committee for review, and the committee makes recommendations of the people going forward. So if you have bylaws that allows kind of this willy-nilly behavior, again, you need to improve the governance of the organization to refocus and make sure that things like that don't unfocus the organization. On the conflict of interest point and the sponsor wanting to be on the board, what's really important to understand about conflicts is that just because somebody comes on a board does not mean that a conflict instantly exists. That's not the law. The law is that the board has to be considering a transaction. And it is only when the board is considering a transaction do we consider whether any of the directors have a conflict at that moment in time. So in the example, let's say the sponsor, it's the catering example. And so we need a caterer for our gala do. And one of the directors says, my husband runs a catering company. He would be great. He'd love to do it. And so the rest of the board can say thanks, no thanks, or that person has now instantly put themselves in a conflict by proposing that the organization enter into a contract, that's the transaction, with their spouse. So how it is required to be dealt with under all the legislation of the various provinces is that, in essence, that person needs to leave the room for the discussion to take place about whether or not to go into they can't participate in the discussion, except in a very limited way in certain provinces, and they absolutely cannot participate in the decision. They have to leave the room during the decision. That allows the rest of the directors to say, this is great, you'll probably give us a good deal, or he's terrible, I don't want to do it. We can get out of it without embarrassing everybody by saying no, thanks very much, but no. So super important.
So I'm being asked to wrap up our discussion. We will be here and will be available to answer questions after, so please feel free to come up to us. We won't be charging by the 6-minute increment, we assure you. So just in conclusion, I'd like to once again thank our sponsor of this session, Fairfax Financial Holdings Limited, for their generous support. I'd also like to thank both Margaret and John for their expertise and sharing their very insightful thoughts. And thank you to everyone in the audience who I did not see anybody fall asleep, which was quite surprising, but success. Yeah, I'll treat that as a victory. So, дуже вам дякую, and we will hope you all have dental health quality over the next few years until the next Congress.
Thank you.